The alarm in Maintenance Bay 7 screamed twice before I forced myself to stop shaking long enough to move. My claws scraped against the cold floor plating as I pressed myself into the shadow of a coolant pipe, my heart hammering so hard I was certain it would give me away. I was starving. I had been starving for weeks. And in exactly 40 seconds, a human named Owen Hale was going to sit down at his usual bench with his lunch tray, and I was going to steal from him again, the way I had every single day for the last 200 cycles, and I still did not understand why he let me. My name is Vexthera. I was a hatchling then, barely out of my growth shell, one of 600 refugees crammed onto a human station called Ceres Outpost after our colony ship lost its reactor core in the Kepler debris field. The humans took us in because a treaty forced their hand, not because they wanted to. I understood that even as a child. I understood it in the way the corridor guards watched us, in the way our rations were counted out in exact, joyless numbers, in the way no human ever looked us directly in the eye. Except one. Owen Hale worked the docking clamps on the lower ring, a broad-shouldered man with grease permanently pressed into the creases of his knuckles. Every day at the same hour he carried his tray into Bay 7, sat on the same bench, and ate with one hand while he repaired hydraulic couplings with the other. He was a creature of routine, the way all humans seem to be, and that routine was the only thing standing between me and starvation. My people burn calories fast during the growth cycle, faster than adults, faster than the ration allotment accounted for. I had watched 2 younger hatchlings collapse in the corridor outside our quarters, their chitin gone dull and gray, and I had promised myself I would not become the third. So I stole, a roll here, a strip of protein there, once an entire orange, its bright peel splitting open under my claws, in a way that flooded my mouth with something I had never tasted before and have never forgotten since. That day, crouched behind the pipe, I watched Owen set his tray down and begin unscrewing a valve casing with a wrench too big for the bolt. My stomach twisted itself into a knot of hunger and fear. I told myself the same lie I told myself every day. He does not notice me. I am fast. I am clever. I am small enough to disappear into the shadows before he ever looks up. I crept forward on silent feet, my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on the tray. A strip of dried protein sat at the edge, close enough to reach without stepping fully into the light. I extended a claw, hooked it, and pulled it toward me in one smooth motion. He did not look up. He never looked up. I retreated into the shadows with my prize clutched against my chest, my pulse roaring in my ears, and I told myself once again that I had gotten away with it, that I was the clever one, that the human maintenance worker eating alone in a cold bay had no idea a starving alien child was picking his tray apart piece by piece, day after day, meal after meal. I believed that lie for a long time. Longer than I should have. It was the day I took half his tray that the lie finally broke. I do not know what possessed me. Perhaps hunger had made me reckless, or perhaps some small, foolish part of me wanted to see how far I could push before something happened. Whatever the reason, I crept forward that day and took not a single strip of protein, not one roll, but nearly half of what remained on his tray, sweeping it into the fold of cloth I used to carry my stolen food back to my quarters. Owen kept turning his wrench. His shoulders did not tense. His breathing did not change. He finished the valve casing, wiped his hands on a rag, and picked up what remained of his lunch as though nothing at all had happened. I stood frozen at the edge of the shadows, no longer hiding, staring at him with a horror that had nothing to do with fear of being caught, and everything to do with a sudden, sickening understanding. He knew. He had always known. Every single day, from the very first orange, he had known exactly what I was doing, and he had done nothing to stop me. I do not know what came over me in that moment, but I stepped fully into the light. Owen looked up at me then, for the first time in 200 cycles, and his eyes were not angry. They were tired, and something else besides, something I did not yet have a word for. "You gonna say something?" he asked. "Or just stand there?" My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. "Why do you let me take your food?" He set the wrench down on the bench beside him, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he does not want to startle a wild animal. "Figured you'd ask eventually." "You knew," I said, "from the first day." "Course I knew." He almost smiled, though it did not quite reach all the way. "You're not exactly subtle, kid. You breathe loud when you're scared." Shame burned through me, hot and sudden. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, looking down at what remained of his tray, at the gap where nearly half his meal had been only moments before. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge entirely. "You're a kid," he said, "a hungry kid. Don't much matter to me what species that comes wrapped in. I got a kid myself, back on the surface colonies. If she was starving on some strange station full of aliens who didn't want her there, I'd want somebody to look the other way and let her eat. I did not understand, not fully, not yet. Your rations are also insufficient, I said. Because it was true. Because I had seen the way his uniform had begun to hang looser at the shoulders over the past several weeks. The way his face had thinned in a manner that mirrored my own hunger back at me. Yeah, well, he shrugged, picking the wrench back up as though the conversation were already finished. I got more to spare than you do. Don't overthink it. I did overthink it. I overthought it for days afterward, lying awake in my berth, turning his words over and over like a stone I could not stop rubbing smooth. He had almost nothing. He was rationed the same as everyone else on that station, stretched thin by a war along the belt corridors that ate through supply convoys faster than they could be replenished. And yet he had decided, without ever being asked, that his almost nothing was still more than my nothing, and he had split it with me in silence rather than force me to beg for it. I did not stop taking from his tray after that conversation. If anything, I think we both understood something had shifted between us, though neither of us spoke of it again. It was no longer simply theft. It became something closer to a ritual, an agreement neither of us said aloud, because saying it aloud would have made it something else entirely, something neither of us was ready to name. He began arriving a few minutes early some cycles, and I noticed, though I never mentioned it, that his tray sometimes carried a little more food than the ration slips technically allowed. I never asked where the extra came from. Later I would learn he had been trading favors with a cook in the lower galley, fixing a broken refrigeration unit in exchange for a few additional grams tucked under his tray each week, a quiet arrangement that could have gotten them both written up if anyone with authority had cared to look closely enough. Nobody looked closely. That was the strange mercy of it. On a station full of people who resented our presence, who saw 600 refugee mouths as 600 reasons their own supplies ran thinner, Owen Hale had decided, without fanfare, without anyone ever telling him to, that a starving child deserved to eat. There were harder days, of course. Days when the tension on the station rose sharp enough to cut. I remember one cycle when a group of dock workers cornered 3 of my people in the lower ring, shouting about resources and blame and things I was too young to fully understand, though I understood the fear in it well enough. Word spread through our quarters fast, the way fear always does, and for a long while afterward I was too frightened to make my usual trip to Bay 7. Owen noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, even when he pretended not to. 3 cycles passed without me stealing so much as a crumb from his tray, and on the 4th, I found a small package waiting near the coolant pipe where I usually hid, wrapped in the same cloth I used to carry food back to my quarters. Inside was bread, still warm, and a strip of dried fruit I did not recognize. I looked up and found him watching me from across the bay, not smiling exactly, but not looking away either. Figured you might need it delivered this week, he said, and went back to his wrench as though it were nothing at all. It was not nothing, it was everything. It was the first time I understood that what existed between us was not pity, was not charity offered from some safe distance, but something closer to a promise. He would not let me starve, whatever else happened on that station, whatever the treaties said or the ration slips allowed, or the other humans muttered under their breath in the corridors. The weeks stretched into months. I grew taller, my chitin darkening the way it does when a hatchling begins to near adulthood, and though the hunger never fully disappeared, it dulled from a screaming thing into something I could manage, something I could survive. I owed that, in no small part, to a maintenance worker who never once asked for anything in return. I asked him once, near the end, why he never told anyone. Not his supervisors, not the other dock workers, not even the cook who quietly helped stretch his rations further than they should have gone. He considered the question for a long moment, setting his tools down the way he always did when he wanted to answer carefully rather than quickly. Some things, he said, you don't do for credit. You do them because it's right, and because doing them quiet means nobody gets to make it complicated. Report it, and suddenly there's forms, there's questions, there's some officer deciding whether a hungry kid deserves an extra ration based on a form she never got to see. Easier this way. Cleaner. Easier for you, I said, or easier for me. Both, I figure. He picked the wrench back up. Mostly you, though. I did not fully appreciate, at the time, what that kind of quiet cost him. It was only much later, long after I had left Sari's outpost, that I learned from station records how thin his own rations had truly run during those months. How many nights he had likely gone without so that his tray would carry enough for both of us. He never once mentioned it. He never once made me feel as though I owed him anything beyond the simple act of showing up hungry and letting him feed me without either of us having to call it what it was. The relief convoy finally arrived in the 611th cycle of our stay, A fleet of Ashvel transport vessels sent to carry our people home after the reactor repairs had finally cleared review on the far side of the belt corridor. Word spread through our quarters like wildfire, an eruption of relief and disbelief in equal measure. We were leaving. After everything. After all the cold looks and the counted rations and the corridors where we were tolerated rather than welcomed, we were finally going home. I should have felt nothing but joy. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow ache settle into my chest as I packed the few belongings I had accumulated during our stay, because I understood that leaving Ceri's outpost meant leaving Owen Hale, and there was no treaty, no diplomatic channel, no convoy schedule that would ever bring me back to Bay 7 again. I went to see him one final time before boarding. I had spent 3 cycles trading small favors of my own, mending a torn environmental suit for a cook's apprentice, translating a stack of technical documents for a dock supervisor who had no patience for Ashvel phonetics, until I had earned enough credit to purchase a single orange from the station's meager produce stock. I found him in Bay 7 exactly where he always was, wrench in hand, tray beside him, as though nothing about that particular cycle were any different from the 211 that had come before it. I set the orange down on his tray without a word, the same way he had always let me take without a word, some unspoken symmetry finally completing itself after all those months. He looked up before I could retreat into the shadows the way I usually did, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. "Didn't have to do that," he said finally. "Neither did you," I answered, 211 times. Something shifted in his expression then, not quite a smile, but close enough to one that I understood it as the human equivalent of everything neither of us had the words to say properly. He reached out and set his hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture I had seen humans exchange with each other but had never once experienced myself. Warm and solid and entirely unfamiliar. "Get home safe, kid," he said. "Thank you," I told him, and I meant it in a way that felt far too small for what I actually owed him, for not letting me ask. He seemed to understand exactly what I meant by that because his jaw tightened slightly before he nodded, once, and turned back to his tray as though the conversation had reached its natural end. I boarded the transport vessel 3 hours later. I did not look back through the viewport as Ceri's outpost shrank into the dark behind us, because I did not trust myself to watch it disappear without something in me breaking that I was not ready to have broken in front of the other refugees crowded into the shuttle bay around me. Years passed after that. I completed my growth cycle, trained in diplomatic service, and eventually became a liaison for the Ashvel Compact, sitting across negotiating tables with representatives from a dozen different species scattered across a dozen different systems. In that role, I have heard humanity discussed and dissected more times than I can count, their motives picked apart, their kindness treated with suspicion by species who cannot imagine an act of generosity that does not come attached to some hidden strategy. I let them believe what they want to believe. It has never been my place to correct them, and diplomacy rarely rewards a liaison who argues too passionately in favor of the species she is meant to be negotiating against on behalf of her own people. But I know what I know. I know a man who had almost nothing looked at a starving alien child hiding behind a coolant pipe and decided, without ever being asked, that his almost nothing was still enough to share. I know he did it quietly, without seeking credit, without ever making me feel as though I owed him a debt I could not repay. I know he did it 211 times, meal after meal, cycle after cycle, on a station where every treaty and every uniform and every wary glance in the corridor told him he owed my people nothing at all. That is not a calculated strategy. No empire has ever been built on quietly pretending not to notice a hungry child stealing bread from your tray. There is no diplomatic advantage gained from warming a piece of fruit and leaving it wrapped in cloth for someone who will likely be gone within the year. That is simply what he was, underneath every uniform and every ration slip and every reason the galaxy might have given him not to care. I have carried that lesson with me through every negotiation I have conducted since, through every treaty I have helped draft. Through every moment I have watched other species argue that kindness without an angle is a contradiction in terms. I have never told this story to another Ashvel without watching them go very still, the particular stillness our kind falls into when something lands too close to the marrow of what we actually believe about the universe. I tell it anyway, whenever the moment calls for it, because someone should know what I learned in a cold maintenance bay over stolen bread and a single orange split open beneath my claws. Someone should know that survival is not only measured in reactors repaired and treaties signed and convoys that arrive on schedule. Sometimes it is measured in something far smaller, far quieter, something that happens behind a coolant pipe while a man keeps his eyes fixed on his wrench and lets a hungry child believe, for just a little longer, that she has gotten away with something. I never did thank him properly, not in the way the debt deserved, But I think, in the end, he never wanted that kind of thanks at all. I think he wanted exactly what he gave me, quietly, without complication, cycle after cycle, until it became the difference between a species that merely survives and one that is worth surviving for. Wherever Owen Hale is now, I hope his own daughter never goes hungry the way I once did. And I hope, somewhere in the vast distance between our two worlds, he understands that a girl who was never truly his to protect grew up carrying his kindness with her into every room she has ever walked into since, using it as a measure against which she judges everyone else she meets. Few have ever come close to matching it,